Aragorn was a good king. We know this because J.R.R. Tolkien said he was a good king, and J.R.R. Tolkien is the fellow who created Aragorn and wrote the story of his life and put down the words Aragorn was a good king, so, for all intents and purposes, Aragorn was a good king, full stop. If, say, hypothetically, someone were to ask questions like, if Aragorn was such a good king, then what, pray tell, was his tax policy? What did he do during times of flood and famine? What was it that made him so damn good? They would of course look very foolish indeed, because the answer to all those questions was already provided to them by Tolkien himself. What was Aragorn's tax policy? It was a good one that helped people, and one that everybody was fine with paying. How did Aragorn react during times of great strife during his reign? Well, for one, times of great strife didn't occur during his reign because it was a good reign, and for two, if hypothetically anything ever did come up, then Aragorn would of course react swiftly and appropriately to whatever the problem was, and it would be promptly dealt with to everyone's satisfaction. The answer to all of these hypothetical questions is the same. In every single way, as a king, Aragorn would crush it. The story of The Lord of the Rings isn't about how the long-lost heir to the kingdom struggles to maintain his nascent reign after going on an exciting world-saving venture with his friends. It's about the exciting world-saving venture that he goes on with his friends. The kingship is more of a final reward for the character, one that's better served in its role in the narrative as a destination than it would be as the starting point for a whole new story. Nobody wants to see Strider argue with counselors about economics. That's not what the story or the characters are really all about. So Aragorn's tax policy must be good for the ending to The Lord of the Rings to work, and, just as importantly, it also must remain a mystery. Because the second Tolkien feels the need to explain stuff like that, the second the door swings back open the other way around, and now he's stuck having to provide answers for a bunch of other in-depth questions that are ultimately unbefitting for the type of fantasy story he is trying to write. However, George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series is befitting for those questions. His world is not written like Tolkien's, despite the undeniable link the two men share. In addition to taking his RR, author George Martin used his own initial inquisitiveness about the unexplored territory of Tolkien's Middle-earth to explore thoughts and concepts within a medieval fantasy setting that he personally found interesting, and then develop those ideas into what would become his landmark series. The questions he raises in that world are questions that originated from his feelings about the original Tolkien text. They inspired him, and so the two authors' most well-known works are intrinsically linked together in mainstream culture because of that and a few other reasons too. Crucially, though, they are still separated, if not culturally, then at least canonically. A Song of Ice and Fire is not a sequel to The Lord of the Rings set in the Age of Man. Bobby Baratheon is not a descendant of Aragorn, the others are not a bunch of orcs that were left in the fridge too long, and Middle-earth is, in fact, not the same place as the Lands Between, even though those words mean basically the same thing as each other. Martin didn't just haphazardly graft his own ideas onto the works of others like some sort of fan fiction author. He conceived a whole new world with new history and new rules, and let his ideas flourish within that setting, instead of tacking those ideas onto the setting of Middle-earth, where they would just trample all over Tolkien's already established canon. It's one of the reasons George Martin is such a great writer, his drive to find new angles in old works, and his ability to transition that work into fascinating new material. Sadly, however, the writers of the various live-action adaptations of his bibliography seem to fail to understand this very simple concept. Sometimes, the stuff you want to talk about doesn't actually fit in with the setting you're talking about them in. Game of Thrones showrunners David Benioff and D.B. Weiss taught everyone that lesson the hard way, but looking back, there were always signs that both of them weren't as fully understanding of the source material as they may have first appeared to be. I mean, sure, the duo was famously able to figure out who Jon Snow's mom was, but they also stated when they were first pitching their HBO series that it would be a realistic historical fantasy television show that would not include dreams, prophecies, or flashbacks of any kind. 3 things that feature pretty prominently in A Song of Ice and Fire. Once they got to the end of their series, they had a lot of egg on their face, not just because they went from working off fully detailed and completed novels to a few pages of cliff notes, but also because all those dreams, prophecies, and flashbacks George Martin kept going on about turned out to actually be pretty important for the narrative. By the end of Game of Thrones, Benioff and Weiss had broken all 3 of their rules, but sadly it wasn't enough to reverse course. They were still one mute zombie and one mummer's dragon short of what they really needed to finish things properly. But one doesn't need to relitigate how those 2 men brought shame upon their houses back in 2019 when they pushed out Game of Thrones' truncated final season into their toilet bowl. Not when HBO has already offered up a fresh new plate of shame to be enjoyed by the masses in this new decade.
Shame! Shame! Shame!
The company's answer to the historic fandom falloff that occurred after Game of Thrones series finale aired was to push forward like a dozen different Ice and Fire TV shows to see if some, or any, would actually stick. So far we've only got one, House of the Dragon, and so far the jury is still out on whether it works, or whether it will be the show that definitively proves that unless your name is Hidetaka Miyazaki, you probably shouldn't bother adapting the written word of George R. R. Martin. You're just going to invite a comparison that can't be lived up to. Amazingly though, the first season of House of the Dragon did, for the most part, live up to that comparison. Original showrunners Ryan Condal and Miguel Sapochnik did a lot of good work turning around the commentary that has followed this franchise ever since you know what. In 10 short episodes, they managed to create a show that, though certainly possessed a different vibe to Game of Thrones, still felt just as familiar to the audiences that once loved and then grew to hate that original series. I think a lot of House of the Dragon's early success came from Condal, Sapochnik, and possibly even co-creator Martin himself being able to accurately understand what most people's favorite parts of Thrones was, and then, as is so often the case with Martin's work, translate it into new, more digestible material. The trio correctly came to the conclusion that most folks were interested in this universe for the big dragon battles and the tense political intrigue. The grand existential world-ending threat of the White Walkers is all well and good, but I'm sure many people would have been fine if Game of Thrones was just a show about King's Landing backstabbing, intermediately broken up by the occasional dragon fight. The Targaryen Civil War, known as the Dance of the Dragons, has all that shit in spades, and with apologies to Nymeria and her ships, unlike some other chapters of Westerosi history, it is already pretty well detailed. The choices these creatives made early on were very well thought out, and the execution of the final product was nothing short of miraculous, especially considering how much they had going against them. They did the unthinkable, and brought folks back to the good old days of the early seasons of Game of Thrones, but now with a more considered approach to the vast lore of the series, and notably, a totally unabashed indulgence towards the dreams and prophecies that Benioff and Weiss tried so hard to exorcise from their show. And then the monkey's paw curled.
What?
With House of the Dragon's exemplary first season already in the books, the folks over at world's greatest entertainment conglomerate Warner Bros. Discovery decided that the best way to approach handling the follow-up to this incredible reversal of fortunes was to shoot the show in the leg and fuck over its writers before they had the chance to fuck over them first. According to Condal and writer-producer Sarah Hess, the scripts for Season 2 of House of the Dragon were complete early last year in January. 10 scripts. 10 scripts for 10 hour-long episodes of television, just like Season 1 had. But something happened early in 2023, something called the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes. And though it wasn't set in stone during March and April, the ball was picking up speed and a collision between the writers and actors with the producers was fast approaching, just as House of the Dragon's production start date was approaching as well. The Antichrist, or David Vaslov as he occasionally goes by, was getting worried. SAG-AFTRA's strikes wouldn't really affect the mostly British production, but the WGA strikes would. If House of the Dragon didn't finish its pre-production before a strike starts, then they could find themselves with material that can't be filmed because it isn't completely finished yet. And who knows how long the strike is going to last? Warner Brothers Discovery might not have any big-ticket items to launch at the beginning of next year's quarter. It's for this exact same money-grubbing reason that Dune Part 2 was pushed back from 2023 to 2024. Thankfully for Vaslov, Denis' film managed to come out pretty unscathed from this decision, but House of the Dragon wasn't so lucky, mostly because, unlike Dune, it wasn't actually finished yet. Pre-production is a long process, and for a show with as many people working on it as House of the Dragon, I can't imagine the process is made easier by brain-dead executives throwing out a fifth of your work right as you're finishing up with it just so they can save themselves a few bucks. Vaslov wanted to have a dragon show ready to view in summer 2024, and it didn't matter to him if the people who worked on that show and made the first season a huge hit had the necessary resources to do what they did again last time. All that mattered to him is that the show would exist and that HBO could sell it when the time came, quality be damned. And so, from this typical Vaslavian business decision, the run of episodes for House of the Dragon's second season was pushed down from 10 to 8. When I initially heard about this, I assumed that following this, the writers had to scramble to rework the season so it would function as an 8-episode story arc, but now that I've actually finished the second season of House of the Dragon, I kind of feel like maybe Vaslov just told them to cut the last 2 episodes out altogether and go into production with what they had already done, because this does not feel like finished work. There are incomplete arcs, characters are stuck in weird holding patterns, and above all else, any semblance of catharsis from the final episodes is practically non-existent. The story just stops. Now, despite their official titles as writers, Condell and Hess did actually offer assistance on the second season, but only in their role as producers. No work could be done by them on anything written, even something as simple as a change in a line of dialogue was not allowed, and with all that in mind, it does make it difficult for me to imagine that the final moments of episode 8 were at all what Condell or Hess had in their mind when they were first putting the story of the season together. Alternatively, though, it could very well be true that the entire season had to be reworked in a very short amount of time, and that's why stuff like Cregan or Rhaena feels so barely present in the narrative, and this was just the best they could manage, but I suppose we will never truly know. It certainly feels like we just won't get to actually see the final 2 episodes of Season 2 until they air 2 years from now as the first and second episodes of Season 3, but sadly the jury is still out on that one as well. Warner Brothers Discovery recently revealed that under David Vaslov's esteemed guidance, it has lost $9 billion in its television assets, and then this was followed up with WB's stock falling 11% after the news dropped. With this in mind, it might be the case where if House of the Dragon, or frankly any TV show, is going to have a future at this company, it is going to have to be in a future where David Vaslov does not have a future at this company. But as much as we all loathe David Vaslov and curse his name under our every breath, it would be unfair of me to blame the entirety of Season 2's less than stellar reception solely on him. Unless, of course, he was the one demanding the writers make Rhaenyra and Alicent gay as fuck.
Come with me.
Amidst the huge amount of criticism that has fallen under Condell and Hess for this season, a fair amount of it, I think, can be traced back to the less than stellar working environment that they and every other American screenwriter found themselves in back in 2023. And really, it is just pretty awful of Warner Brothers and HBO to fuck them over like this and then force them to stand in the spotlight taking all the hits for a situation that only exists because of their own failure to run their business. Although, I can't pretend that there's not more to the story than dumb, evil executives being evil and dumb. Especially now, but we'll get to that later. HBO did put these writers in a shitty situation, that's true, but what they did once they were in that situation revealed some troubling signs. Signs that were not too dissimilar to the signs we saw back when Game of Thrones started to go downhill. To be clear, I don't think we're in quite that bad a spot yet. I'd say it's more of a Season 5 quality level than a 7 or 8, but even that is more than enough to grow trepidatious about this show's future. Criticisms have ranged from bemoaning the numerous book changes by die-hard lore nerds like me, to painting the season with the moniker The Season That Never Was, since you know not all that much really happened. The internet being the internet, these comments have ranged from the considered and helpful to the brain-dead and blatantly misogynistic with virtually no in-between. Having given it some thought for myself, however, I think the vast majority of the problems with this show can be funneled down to 3 distinct issues that the writers keep running into trouble with over and over again. They are as follows. 1. The writers don't know how to prioritize show time. 2. The writers don't understand the limits of the world their story takes place in. And, at the risk of being called blatantly misogynistic myself, 3. I think the writers don't appear to really know how to write for women. Anymore. And I really don't understand what's changed and why that's now the case. I thought that Condell and Hess did a really good job during Season 1. All the female characters felt like they had depth. Rhaenyra and Alicent's friendship descending into mutual animosity felt very real, and the show still gave space for both of them to have their own distinct arcs separate from each other that organically developed across the season. However, in Season 2, it's like every writer's brain stopped working once they had to write for a female character, especially if those characters were named Rhaenyra or Alicent. We are just not meant to dislike or harshly consider the actions of the women on this show the same way we are asked to for our male characters. Across the board, there is not a single woman that is written to be slightly warmongering or embittered or anything other than steadfast and noble and righteous in the face of all these petty men heedlessly throwing lives away in this stupid, pointless war. Though I think this has been done in an effort to make the women appear more moral and give more representation to the blatant inherent sexism of the Seven Kingdoms, I think it has also had many other far worse side effects too. Chief among them is how this decision to make every woman an anti-war advocate completely flattens any one of these characters' chances for emotional or personal depth. They are all just way too similar to each other. Cersei, Ygritte, Arya, Catelyn, Daenerys, Brienne, all of these people are women who live in a cruel, patriarchal world that affords them very little agency. But all of these women have very different reactions to this fact, and, crucially, not all of them experience the trappings of the patriarchy in Westeros the same way the others do. This is because even in a society that doesn't allow or consider women to be people, women still act and behave with all the same rich complexity any other person would have because, hey, go figure, women are people too. Not inherently good people, not inherently bad people, but people. People who are capable of displaying all of the pathos that their male counterparts have, and pathos is informed by empathy, and it's a little difficult to have empathy for someone who just seems so above everything that's happening to them, especially when what's happening to them seems pretty fucking stressful. In House of the Dragon, it feels like the base setting for every woman in the Seven Kingdoms is innate virtuousness. For some reason, her son getting eaten by a dragon and a once loyal man sneaking into her bedroom to stab her with a big sword made Rhaenyra want to end the war peacefully, not escalate it in any way. She is first counseled to use restraint from Rhaenys, and after she dies, Mysaria replaces her to tell Rhaenyra the exact same thing again. None of these women respond to these actions taken against them with any real emotion or stake in the outcome, and always with a complete awareness of the full situation and the consequences of their response and everyone else's. They're all just so fucking great. Rhaenys doesn't even really seem to mind her husband fathering 2 bastard children right under her nose. Isn't that just so kind and decent of her? And after all, that's what makes characters interesting, right? Their lack of flaws. The only lady who sticks out amongst the bunch as purposefully presented with a little nuance to her actions is the Dowager Queen Alicent, who spends most of Season 2 coming to terms with the fact that maybe she may have ruined everything for everyone by aiding in this Hightower coup. One of my favorite scenes of the season is when she realizes in real time that the group of people whose whole argument is that a woman's rule is invalidated by any man standing around next to her don't actually want her, a woman, to be in charge when there's all these other men standing around next to her who could do it instead. Even if I felt the show indulged in her arc a little too much this season, I still saw this portrait of a compelling character. A mother who was doing everything she could to save her children from the grim, bloody fate she imagined was an unavoidable destiny, but also a mother who slowly was coming to realize that she was as incapable of actually helping her children avoid this fate as she was at preventing her own. Alicent has been given so few options for her entire life. The choice to believe that her dying husband, who never really seemed to love her quite as much as his first wife, or her only surviving child, would make her son his heir instead, was almost like a reckless act to reclaim her own agency. And of course, she directs her loss of control not at the actual masters of her life, like her father Otto, but instead against Rhaenyra. Rhaenyra, the symbol for everything she has been taught to fear. The monster that will take away her children forever. The heir who proved her husband never truly favored her, and the woman who at one point in time was her closest and dearest friend. That is a portrait of the human heart in conflict with itself if I ever saw it. And it also serves as a pretty good layout for a character arc for her this season. To me, everything was going so good for Alicent's story. We see her struggle with herself. We see her try and fail to be a mother, and it seems like it's going to go somewhere interesting, but then all that great characterization gets flushed down the toilet in the last episode when Alicent betrays her entire family by going to Rhaenyra and even asks her to fucking elope with her. Huh? Shouldn't there be like a million different reasons why this won't work and a billion different reasons why Alicent shouldn't be in favor of this plan? In the final moments of episode 8, all of Alicent's internal conflicts are given precedence, and none of her external connections are shown to matter in the slightest. It's like her and Rhaenyra are the only characters on the show. Alicent spends this whole season trapped in a place that affords her no agency, and then the way she gets it back is by shrugging her shoulders and telling a woman she should by all rights despise, and more importantly, not trust at all, that she can go murder all the men of her family if she wants to, it's no big deal. Apparently, just like Maelor, Jaehaerys didn't even exist, and fuck that nice kid I never see from Old Town, he probably has it coming anyway. This is, of course, not at all how Alicent acted in Fire and Blood. In fact, Book Alicent wielded a lot more authority during the war than Show Alicent ever has. It makes me wonder how this Alicent is even going to surrender King's Landing to Rhaenyra when they've hammered it down so much that she has no real power in the capital to speak of. Maybe questions like that are just pointless to ask, though, since by this point in time, I have just come to accept that her, and also Rhaenyra, are just completely different characters from who they were in the books.
I don't distrust you because you're a woman. I distrust you because you're not as smart as you think you are.
Condell and Hess have really run with the whole Fire and Blood is a historical retelling written by a maester in Westeros years after the events occurred, so everything being written should be taken with a grain of salt thing, as basically permission to just do whatever they want with this story and pretend it's still in line with the source material even when it obviously isn't. It's like after George complimented them on how they handled Viserys, the two of them got such a big head. And though there are certainly more than a few distinct differences between the character in Fire and Blood and Paddy Considine's excellent portrayal, I think what made that character work so well in the first season was how they carried over and adapted what was already established about the character in the book, and not necessarily because they did a full-on rewrite. They didn't, by the way. I think the two Viserys are actually pretty similar in nature, despite what Martin himself might think. In Fire and Blood, Viserys is a very nice fat man who doesn't seem to understand the full reality of what being a king means, but one who still, nevertheless, manages to keep the realm together during his reign, despite a lot of near catastrophic events occurring, mostly thanks to his dipshit little brother and his conniving hand. Sounds a lot like our Paddy, but fatter and with less anxieties about the burdens of being a king. The big moment in the show that everyone likes, where Viserys takes to the Iron Throne and defends his daughter's claim, is borrowed from the books, where it is told in a much less exciting fashion. There, after Vaemon says Rhaenyra's kids are bastards, Daemon just goes over to Driftmark and cuts off his head then and there. Afterwards, a bunch of other Velaryons go to King's Landing to complain about it to Viserys, but he just basically shrugs and says, "Hey, I said anyone who questions my grandchild's parentage is gonna get their tongues cut out. I don't know what you guys expected," before he has their tongues cut out. Two very different moments, but I think it shows House of the Dragon's adapting techniques at its best. Condell and Hess turned the event into one scene, and though it didn't follow through in the exact same sequence or lead to the same final outcome, the purpose of this moment in the narrative is still the same and is in fact amplified by what the showrunners altered. In both versions, this is the one moment where Viserys truly stands up for his daughter and lets his powers as king be exercised. He spent his whole life not taking the role seriously, but here, this one time, he acts how he should have acted when he was a younger man. Ultimately, it isn't enough to change the course of history, but that's what makes the scene and the dinner speech that follows all the more moving in both cases. It's evidence that maybe if Daemon and Rhaenyra and Otto and Alicent weren't such bitter bitches about everything, the war could have been avoided. There is just nothing even close to that level in Season 2, certainly nothing that was expressed by the female characters, because to do so would be to put them in an awkward, uncomfortable situation that might make the audience question the decency of their characters, at least by modern standards. Rhaenyra and Alicent have to have so much put on their shoulders because the writers insist on centering so much of the narrative around them. But the thing is, if they wanted to show some women with gray character arcs and also maybe bring a little bit more LGBTQ representation to the series, there are so many other characters that they could have used to explore this in Fire and Blood who aren't Rhaenyra or Alicent. I mean, not to overblow things too much, but why have Black Aly and Sabbatha Frey not shown up yet? What the fuck? If Condell and Hess wanted to tell a story about two queer women navigating the realities of their unorthodox relationship in a patriarchal medieval world set to the backdrop of a dragon civil war, why the fuck did they get rid of these two? And decide instead to make it so it seems like every woman who meets Rhaenyra is just 5 seconds away from giving her a big kiss. Marilda of Hull is gone too, which coupled with all the other feminine omissions is just confusing. At least 5 named female characters fight in battle for Rhaenyra's cause, and you'd think that that would be an angle the show would really want to explore. In this world where women have so little authority, what does it mean for the lower-born women of the Seven Kingdoms when for once they're given a chance to fight for someone like them? On that note, Jane Arryn is a female character in Fire and Blood who is in the series, although it is worth noting in the book she was heavily implied to have been in a lesbian relationship with Jessamine Redfort, and that at least so far has not been brought up at all. We find out some other cool things about her in Fire and Blood too, like how her male cousin tried twice to usurp her rule of the Vale before she locked him in a cell and threw away the key. She also has this whole line to Rhaenyra about how, in this world of men, we women must band together. A nice detail that provides insight into how, the other noble women of Westeros are not unaccustomed to being poorly treated by the men in their own families, and as such are all the more likely to sympathize with Rhaenyra's cause. The Jane we have in the show is a flat curmudgeon who yells at some child for the actions of her aunt that she's supposed to be supporting. Though in the books we don't learn much about her character during the dance, Jane's support of Rhaenyra felt like such a natural and cool addition to the story. Like Black Aly and Sabbatha Frey, it showcases how Rhaenyra, being a woman making a genuine claim for the crown, was having a real effect on the rest of the women of Westeros, some of whom were following by her example and who would proudly come to join her and fight in her army. For some reason, all of these elements have been cut out of the series thus far, as has frankly much of the other minor lords and knights who make up the armies of the Greens and the Blacks. It is very weird. It's like the showrunners just don't want to have to hire any additional actors, and are instead forcing the storylines from the other characters onto Rhaenyra and Alicent, similarly to how they gave Aemma Arryn the same death as Alyssa Velaryon in the pilot. I understand the drive for this, but there is only so much one single character can uphold. There's some things that just aren't going to fit together. Like, hypothetically, if you replaced a lowborn character with a character who's a member of the richest noble house in the entire fucking kingdom. Game of Thrones had issues like this too. deciding it was better to lose a character like Arion or Victarion or Aegon, so other already established characters can replace their role in the story, and audiences won't have to worry about learning a new name, or not learning a new name in the case of Aegon. Another unwelcome reflection of that series comes from the reappearance of an element of late-era Game of Thrones that I'm sure everyone universally hated, that being characters talking about war as if they're historians looking back on it from the modern day. Suddenly, everyone knows the entire Geneva Convention and follows strict rules of engagement, and of course the lines for who talks like this and who doesn't are drawn strictly parallel to gender. Rhaenys wants to stop the war, Rhaenyra wants to stop the war, Mysaria wants to stop the war, Alicent wants to stop the war, Alice Rivers wants to stop the war, and all of them, for some reason, are extremely concerned about the well-being of the common folk until they aren't. I can understand this coming from Mysaria and maybe Alice, but when Hugh Hammer's wife and even that one prostitute who cuddles with Aemond are cautioning thick-headed men about the effects of war, the whole thing just comes off as a little disingenuous, both for the men and the women watching this show. Rhaenyra and Alicent were unfairly portrayed by the historians of Westeros, that is true, but when George Martin mentioned that, he was talking about stuff like how Rhaenyra being a little overweight after going through 5 pregnancies was unfavorably compared to the older, yet slimmer and sexier, Alicent Hightower, and was even suggested by some that this may have been a reason for her resentment towards the stepmother who helped steal her birthright and murder her children. He wasn't saying, oh, how sexist of these maesters to call Rhaenyra fat. He was saying, oh, how sexist of the maesters to believe that because Rhaenyra was fat and jealous, that was why she went to war. And, oh, how sexist of all Westerosi society to view Rhaenyra as unworthy just because now she's a fat old mom and not the cute, precocious little realm's delight we used to know and like. The Dance of the Dragons was a war that was chiefly instigated by the actions of 2 women. 2 women who through the course of the war exercised more martial authority than any other woman has at almost any other time in Westeros, as long as you don't count Dorne. They were tarred and feathered by the maesters and the common folk alike for daring to do so, but at the end of the day, the fate of Alicent and Rhaenyra is a fate that both of them put a lot of work in building for themselves. They made decisions in Fire and Blood, but in House of the Dragon, they feel like victims, more so than they ever did when the misogynist record keepers were telling their story.
The fact that you are a woman means we will have no more women presidents, because we tried one and she fucking sucked.
But feminist posturing aside, the main issue with all of these changes of characterization is that most of these changes are just fucking boring. It's not impactful or interesting to watch Rhaenyra have the exact same stupid argument with her all-male council without anything actually changing or anything new being said. Which brings me to my next point. This show does not know how to spend its time at all. And though some of this can be, again, chalked up to Vaslavian episode fuckery, the issue runs a lot deeper than that. Even with a full 10-episode season, I don't think Daemon receiving enlightenment through prolonged microdosing was ever going to be something that people were going to be on the edge of their seat excited for. His storyline is a good example of how bad this season was at managing its time and prioritizing its beats because, despite what some have said, on paper, like Alicent, I think the choices made for Daemon's story this season make a lot of sense and are a really good direction to take the character in. Blood and Cheese was basically the last evil thing that Daemon does in the dance. For the rest of the story on, he's basically the MVP of Team Black, and so I understand why the showrunners would want to show how Daemon starts to mellow out and become more devoted to Rhaenyra's cause, even if we didn't explicitly see how this happened in Fire and Blood. Likewise, the fact that they decided to make full use of Harrenhal's status as a big, spooky, haunted castle, and the witch Alice Rivers' future connections with Aemond as the groundwork for how Daemon would start to change, is fitting and makes good economical use of the castle and the character. I even really liked the way they frame it at the start and the end, with Daemon and Rhaenyra's 2 big confrontations, and the through line of the season being their refusal to talk to each other and come to some kind of understanding. It is, like Alicent's story, all on paper a really good side plot that fits in well with how Daemon will probably be used for the series going forwards. The issue is that once taken off page and put on screen, it becomes clear that scene after scene after scene of this is not really providing us more insight into Daemon's character, nor is it developing aspects of the world or pushing the narrative of the Riverlands forward. It's just weird dream sequence after weird dream sequence with nothing new gained. Truly, what were we supposed to learn from watching Daemon fuck his mom? What did that say about Daemon's character other than the most obvious fucking thing? The whole extended Harrenhal trip is just a long road to travel down so Daemon can learn that he isn't destined to be king. Alice even directly spells it out to him just in case the 6 episodes of dream characters spelling it out to him didn't clue the audience in. And though Daemon is the 3rd most important character on this show, because that's the way Condell and Hess have decided to frame the series, he still spends the majority of his plotline this season talking to ghosts and one single woman who nobody else speaks to. Doesn't that feel like such a huge waste? Furthermore, if they wanted to make this story a little bit more compelling and feel like the ending wasn't such a foregone conclusion, they could have done more to not make Daemon look like such a fucking idiot who can barely put together an army. I get having everybody in the Riverlands hate him because it's Daemon, of course that's how they'd feel about him, but when the whole season is spent drilling in over and over again how bad Daemon is at inspiring loyalty and how petty he can be, and then wrapping it all up with some fucking muppet saving him from himself, it kind of all comes together to turn the character who was the fan favorite of season 1 and who is the author favorite of the entire Targaryen dynasty into a bit of a lame duck. But that's not where the issues stop. All over the place this season, there are just so many instances of extended scenes and sequences being either too long or too short for their own good. Characters that should be given bigger moments are only offered slight subplots that rarely intersect with other storylines unless necessary, while others crisscross each other multiple times without rhyme or reason. There's a sense of sparseness and a bare minimum quality to the layout of certain scenes, not just because occasionally it feels like some characters should be way more involved in events than they actually are, but also because when certain characters are finally involved, they just don't do or say anything, and if they do, it's something that was already said or done before by somebody else earlier. Corlys is number 1 on that list, but this shadow falls over almost every storyline this season, and it makes the whole show suffer a great deal because of it. Now, granted, some of this may be the result of the many changes made to the story already, and to be sure, even with my book and George R.R. Martin blog knowledge, I don't know exactly what is going to happen with these characters in the future. Some have been dropped already, some have been merged together, and some, like Darren and Sunfire, are in a weird Schrodinger's box-like form where their existence is predicated on whatever happens to them next season. Speaking of prioritizing, if there was ever evidence to prove that these showrunners are not doing a good job setting up the story, it's the fact that Daemon is still totally MIA. We can see why they might maybe not want to bring up this character until he actually does something, but I fear in doing so they aren't really giving the future Daemon much to work with. His whole thing is that he's the one good green, the noble, kindly young prince who, when the blacks are at their most triumphant, makes you still care and maybe even support the Greens a little bit. However, his story as it's written in the book is pretty slight. He lives in Old Town, he takes to his dragon, and then he becomes a surprise hero for the Greens before fortunes turn, and he dies a pretty unceremonious and mysterious death. Daemon the Daring does not really do all that much outside of fighting some battles, so there was a lot of room for them to build up the inner world of this character, much like they successfully did with other more thinly sketched in characters. Hess and Condell could have explored how he feels about his family, how he feels about the growing war and his place outside of it at the start, versus how he feels at the end when he's the presumed heir that everyone's pinning their hopes on. All of that was ripe for exploration, and now it's all gone. And the final 2 seasons are going to have to fill in Daemon's whole character amidst all the other plot stuff he and the other characters still have to do. Why not have just introduced him early on so you could have done all the character work there? Then put him on the back burner until you need him later. They did it to Bran that one time, why not now? Because not introducing Daemon already doesn't actually solve any problem. It just means you'll have to do all the work you're not doing now at some other future date, and when that happens, the show might be a little too busy with big battles for important character introductions like that. And even without being physically in the show, it's not like we're actually saving time here. Alicent still has to ask about him. The council still mentions him a bunch. They are still laying the groundwork for the character so people don't forget about him. It just feels like for some reason they didn't pull the final trigger and just hire someone to play the kid already. I could go on listing more and more examples, like how Corlys only has one scene with Rhaenyra where he acts like her hand in the whole season, or how Cregan only has one single scene with Jace, but for some reason there's 3 scenes of Philosophy Tube flirting with Tywin Lannister. Both Jace and Tywin need allies, but for some reason we spend less time in the North than we do with the Triarchy. And to me, that cannot be anything other than a mistake. In this case, nothing but a mistake would make sense. I know how important Cregan Stark and the North is to the Dance of the Dragons, and I know how important Shirako Lohar and the Triarchy is as well. I read all about it in that book that this show is apparently based on. Even if we're seeing the entirety of Viserys II's adventures across the Narrow Sea, I can't think of a single reason why Condal and Hess would focus so much on this character who does one single thing in the books and then dies, other than, I don't know, maybe they're just fans of Abigail's? If they truly are, though, that didn't stop them from doing her and her character pretty fucking dirty here. Lohar is introduced to us as a man in the show, with he/him pronouns, but in actuality, Lohar is only presenting as a man when she is in fact a trans woman. All her wives are only there to keep up appearances, and that's why she asks Tywin to sleep with them, to keep the con going so she can pass off the children as her own offspring, a la what happens to Oakenfist later on. Absolutely none of this is made apparent in the scenes we see in the last episode, and I only know about it because I was reading up on the show online afterwards. Also, apparently behind the scenes, Condal and Hess reassured Abigail that these wives are not being held with Lohar under duress and fully consent to everything that she does with them. Which both seems like a lie they told an actor so they wouldn't cause trouble, and also is, again, something that is not in any way felt or expressed within the episode at all. Could have been interesting, but guess not. Really, this is just another case of Condal and Hess merging 2 characters together without thinking of the consequences this might cause. Lohar's more flamboyant traits are adopted from the character Recalio Rindoon, and though I could buy that based on what we know about Rindoon and their more lofty progressive ideas for the Stepstones, they probably did act this way, I still do not see any of this being depicted in the composite character on House of the Dragons. What I see is the making of a second Euron Greyjoy. Sorry, Abigail.
A finger in the bum. Not now. We'll talk later.
If you were to ask me who's the character I was most looking forward to see from Fire and Blood on screen in House of the Dragon, I would probably say Unwin Peake. Obviously, he's the best character George ever wrote. But since it's unlikely we're going to get to the Caltrops anytime soon, a close second would probably be the character Nettles. She was such a fun figure to have in the story, a dragon rider who came from nothing, and who went on to comport herself with more humanity and decency than most other folks ever managed to express in this entire series. Then, at the end of the war, she gets to be a cool mountain witch with a dragon and a clan of mountain men who worship her. She is just fucking awesome. Much has been made about Nettles' apparent exclusion from the series and the reasoning behind it occurring, but I'll just skip right to the end and tell you that I hate this decision more than any other decision made for the show. It is awful, and I really wish it weren't happening. Currently, House of the Dragon has replaced Nettles with Rhaena Targaryen, Daemon's daughter who gets mourning at the end of the war. Admittedly, there are more than a few reasons why this choice might appear to make a lot of sense on paper. Nettles was, after all, implied to have had a paternal relationship with Daemon. Rhaena also doesn't have much to do in the story until the end of the war anyway, and, at least based off descriptions from the book, Nettles was physically a lot like show Rhaena. That is to say, a young, dark-skinned girl, minus, of course, the Targaryen-Velaryon ancestry, and even then, that last point is only actually a maybe. If you were unfamiliar with the character, you'd be forgiven for asking what the big deal is. The show already has a million different characters. Why confuse things by throwing another one into the mix when we have one already sitting around here doing nothing? However, the big issue with this replacement is that as of yet, Reyna has not done anything to act in any way that Nettie was implied to have acted, nor has she been presented as an all too appealing counteroffer for what she provided for the story of The Dance of the Dragons. I mean, if Reyna is gonna replace the best fucking character in the entire fucking dance, she better at least start fucking cursing God's fucking damn it. Or maybe it must be acknowledged that there is much more to the character of Nettles than just possibly having a familial relationship with Daemon and also being a young girl with brown skin. As far as I've seen, these are the only two things the characters actually share. Their histories and their personalities could not be more different from one another, at least right now. Nettles' role in the narrative was primarily to serve as a big middle finger to the whole idea of Targaryen supremacy when it comes to their dragons. She was the only dragon rider who had no apparent Valyrian ties, and also the only one who managed to earn a dragon through her own patience and cunning. With her exclusion, now House of the Dragon doesn't really have anyone filling in that role, except maybe Ulf, since he's the only dragon rider with dubious ancestry. Ulf is also a huge shithead, though, so I don't think he's going to end up having the same effect on the narrative that Nettles had. There was also another role she served in the narrative, but to talk about that, we need to first talk about subtext. House of the Dragon early on made the choice to present House Velaryon as dark-skinned, and, at the risk of having the conversation around this video hijacked by racists or by people calling me racist, I'd like to posit that maybe this wasn't actually such a great idea. Maybe the choice to turn the richest house in the world at this point in time and one of the last powerful vassals of the former giant slave empire into being a predominantly black family was kind of a really bad choice, or at the very least, a very misguided one. Like, I don't think George Martin was exactly being subtle when he characterized the Valyrian Empire as being made up of a bunch of evil slavers obsessed with keeping bloodlines pure. Nor was he being subtle when he made them a bunch of blonde, purple-eyed, pale freaks who love shoving people into volcanoes so they can work them to death. It does mean something that House of the Dragon turned one of the last surviving representations of that empire in this world to be headed by a black family, unlike how they were described in the books. When you consider the full context of what this means for the narrative of the world and the intention of the story, you must concede that if nothing else, it does say something a little different from what was being said before. Now, that doesn't automatically mean worse or even necessarily bad. There are, after all, a plethora of canonical reasons for why the Velaryons would look like that and have it still make sense. Reasons that I'm sure George Martin is more than willing to explain to you in detail on his blog if you give him the opportunity. And you know, on principle, I'm not opposed to shifting the race of certain characters on screen just for the purposes of diversity, and also making it easier to tell which families people are a part of in this vast, vast cast of characters. Like most of the changes made for this show, the initial idea wasn't standing on unsound logic, but still, the premise reeks to me of a corporate mentality towards representation. Like, are we actually really making a commitment to tell stories about black people? Or are we just telling the same stories about white people we were before, but now getting black people to play some of the white parts so we can all feel a little bit better about ourselves? I just don't like the idea of Warner Bros. And HBO getting too much credit for an idea that probably was only made for the sake of optics. Game of Thrones had this certain reputation about it, and it's a reputation I'm sure they were trying to avoid for House of the Dragon. But the representation of Old Valyria in this show does matter for the story, and the effects of this decision spring outwards in ways that I'm sure the showrunners didn't intend, but are still happening whether they like it or not. And I'm sorry, but if the main effect of turning the Velaryons black was making it so the producers of this show felt like they didn't need to introduce one of the only important black characters in the entirety of the Song of Ice and Fire, since 3 young black girls on screen at the same time would get way too confusing for audiences, well, then that's kind of a big fucking piss-off. And I know that's a cynical way to think about it, but has the way Warner Brothers acted under Voslav's leadership really made you think that anything but corporate cynicism is guiding their direction? The descendants of Valyria being all a bunch of weird, pale brother and sister fuckers meant something greater for the message of the story, just like Nettles being a poor, homeless black girl who everyone looked down on meant something very important too. Rhaena can't really be that, but Nettles can. And that's not to say that Nettles is or should be the be-all, end-all of black representation in this series. In fact, it would be a lot nicer if Nettles wasn't one of the only important dark-skinned characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. But look, if we're not telling her story anymore, then what story are we really telling now? And what is it this new story actually represents? Regardless of what their relationship really was, I feel it ultimately says a lot about Daemon that the only feminine figure in his entire life who he actually seemed to truly love and cherish and treat with any degree of respect was a young, scruffy, foul-mouthed orphan homeless daughter of a whore. Rhaena cannot be any of these things. Her grandfather is the richest man in Westeros, her father is the king consort, her sister is the future queen, her stepmom is the current queen, and her birth mother was most certainly not a whore by any definition. She is one of the most privileged little girls in the entire Planetos at this moment in time, and no, not having a dragon and being ignored by her deadbeat dad is not something that feels very noteworthy or noble for her to strive above. Especially when, as is depicted in the show, this is done at the cost of protecting her nephews like she was told to do by Rhaenyra. It is so strange to me that the writers chose to have Rhaena walk off alone into the Highland wilderness like that, rather than just have her do what Nettles did with the sheep. That would have been a hell of a lot more interesting to watch, and would have at least set up Rhaena in a way that doesn't make her seem like a spoiled brat who risks the lives of herself and a couple of little kids so she can go claim a nuclear fucking weapon. I felt something for Nettles when she became a dragon rider. I felt something when after the Battle of the Gullet, she was the only one who had a visceral human reaction to Jace's death, especially considering she didn't even really know the guy. None of this can happen with Rhaena, and the alternatives they've set up thus far just don't seem nearly as satisfying. Or, even worse, they just seem flat out illogical.
What about Frank Sabaka? I'm not hearing his name in here anywhere.
Which finally brings me to my last and arguably most crucial point. When Condolan has set up something in this story, I don't think they really understand what the full consequences of that decision are. Not just for the future of the show, but also for the surrounding lore of the world of A Song of Ice and Fire as well. And already I can hear some people shouting out, who cares? At this point the show clearly exists in a completely different continuity from the books. Why does it matter? But ultimately House of the Dragon is still heavily borrowing all its material from George's world, and George sketched out the details of Planetos very intentionally. Certain rules exist far beyond the context by which they were originally introduced to the audience in. And it's important not to mess around with even one area because it's likely going to end up causing problems elsewhere too. Let's start with an easy example of what I'm talking about here. Rhaenyra decides in the 3rd episode of Season 2 that she wants to sneak into King's Landing herself so she can deliver a message to Alicent alone and hopefully sue for peace. Right off the bat, there are a lot of problems with this moment, both for book readers and for regular TV show watchers too. If you're a book reader, you're watching this scene knowing that unless they're making huge changes to the narrative, this isn't going to go anywhere, and nothing will actually change because of this interaction. You might be able to say this isn't the case for a show watcher, but even if you have no prior knowledge from the books, no one is really expecting the whole conflict of the entire show to end in the 3rd episode of the 2nd season. Going into the scene, there is not a soul in the audience who believes Rhaenyra is actually going to achieve peace, and so, to us, it feels like a stupid decision because it's a decision that exists outside of the parameters of what we know to be possible for this TV show. You could argue that maybe you might think there might be some greater intrigue going on that this moment will build to later on, but that feeling only lasts as long as the scene lasts. Once it's over, you're faced with two unavoidable facts. The fact that nothing about the Sept scene really changed anything in the story, and now, since Daemon just showed up in King's Landing himself last episode without any issue, it really feels like anyone can just show up wherever the writers need them to show up, logic be damned. When you haphazardly throw in scenes like this, so you can have your two lead actresses together without having it make any sense first, you're effectively inviting people to not give a shit about the stakes of the universe, since clearly you don't either. And you can act like, well, if this were real, Rhaenyra wouldn't know the war was inevitable, and so her making this genuine attempt to end it peacefully only makes sense. The problem with that idea is that Rhaenyra already tried to make a genuine attempt to end it peacefully last season, so we're just repeating ourselves here, but much more importantly, this show is not a real historical accounting of events that actually happened. Like Fire and Blood, it's a story. A story written by writers who control the reality of this world and everything that happens in it like a god. You can't tell us to have an emotional investment in your show if you're going to keep changing the rules on us. And it's this that's going to kill House of the Dragon faster than anything else it's doing. People discount how much a television series teaches its audience how to watch it, what to expect from it, what to accept from it. The longer the show goes on, the more this relationship is built between the show and its viewers. But like a real relationship, if you destroy the trust that's been created by breaking one or more of your own rules, the results can be devastating. George Martin is famous for writing stories where nobody is safe and where common sense is weaponized against storytelling conventions to attack characters who think just because they're the protagonist or because readers like them, they'll be safe from avoiding their grim fate. He does that by always being fair with his audience, by letting them know the rules of the game before he tells you how and why someone just lost it so brutally and utterly. If you instead create an environment where, like every other fucking story ever written, the most important people are safe and sound until the story has decided it's now the most emotionally appropriate time for them to die, then you're just turning all these three-dimensional individuals into dolls. Dolls who are being pulled down from the shelf to play with for a bit, and then put back up without any consequence or sense of loss. This is precisely what House of the Dragon is doing when it creates these schmuck-bait side quests like Rhaenyra not being able to do anything until she finds Luke's body, or Jace going off to the twins to negotiate because they gave all the important stuff he did in the story to his mom, so now they have to invent something new for him to do. And for some reason, they didn't also use this as an opportunity to introduce Sabbatha Frey, even though it would have been the perfect point to do it. This lack of awareness and just complete unwillingness to take advantage of opportunities presented to them in their own scripts has already hampered House of the Dragon's ability to be emotionally resonant. I'll just say it, I didn't give a flying, fire-breathing fuck when Rhaenys died. Why should I? What did she ever do that was so interesting or helpful? Her advice to Rhaenyra about being cautious in Season 2 is proven to be objectively incorrect since it leads to nothing and actively hampers their cause. In Season 1, she doesn't kill the Greens when she has the chance to, but she's fine with all the small folks dying underneath her as she escapes the dragon pit. Then afterwards, she tells Corlys to support Rhaenyra going to war, and then when she finally does go to battle, the only people she actually kills are soldiers and maybe one dragon depending on what they change in the future seasons. Her flying back to fight off Vhagar doesn't seem brave, just stupid. You were ambushed and you made it out alive while also getting rid of Sunfire. Take the fucking win, girl! Rhaenyra has so many more dragons that could have all ganged up on Vhagar with you later on, but instead, she does something reckless that gets her and her dragon killed. Even though this isn't what happened in the books, I could admittedly see book Rhaenys doing something like this. She was pretty headstrong after all. But show Rhaenys was depicted more like a cautious diplomat. Why would she risk it all like this? Her whole character arc was just so messy. And, maybe I could believe that her going after Vhagar was an attempt to make up for not killing the Greens when she had the chance last season, but if that's the case, once more, I have to say this show has done a very poor job conveying that information to me. What's worse is I can already feel this same thing happening again to Jace. By the end of Season 2, all his contributions to the story are done, except for the last one, the one where he dies. So much of what Jace does in the dance was taken from him by others or shifted and reworked into something different, and like Rhaenys, it's made his character so messy. He's defiant against his mother while also supporting her unquestionably, and he's sullen and mopey, but brave and forthright. And he suggests using the Dragon Riders, but hates that the Dragon Riders are ultimately used. He's just not a character I felt I've got a good handle on thus far. And on top of that, aside from the twins, he hasn't really done anything, and we're like 5 seconds away from his fucking death. The second season is pockmarked with examples of stuff like this happening. Otto disappearing for the entire season to hang out with Venom, then reappearing at the end without explanation, or the constant telegraphing of future events like Helena telling Eamon exactly how he's gonna die. Stuff like that is probably a lot more noticeable if you're a book reader, but over and over again, this constant lack of understanding of consequence is killing this show's ability to be interesting. And I think it's just gonna get a lot worse going forward. The toxic butterflies have hatched, and like George Martin, I'm really worried about what their future flutterings are going to cause.
How the fuck do you write so many books so fast? I think, I've had a really good 6 months. I've written 3 chapters.
If you are not aware, on September 4th, George Martin made a blog post that he has since deleted called Beware the Butterflies. I'll include a link in the description. In that blog post, he pretty unambiguously calls out his frustrations with the direction of House of the Dragon, and especially his overall unhappiness with Ryan Condal specifically. Reading through it, the big takeaway seems to be that there was at some point some sort of mini falling out between Martin and Condal, born from the fact that Condal probably hasn't been speaking entirely honestly to George Martin during his visits to the writer's room. Because of the nature of the deal Martin made with HBO back in 2007, he actually has no real say in any of these shows, so though I'd like to believe this breakup was because of HBO and Warner Brothers being shitty and holding Condal's feet to the fire last year, given Martin's comments about the direction of Season 3, I'm beginning to believe his frustrations are solely directed at Condal and not so much at the home box office. He, so far, has only said nice things about the Dunk and Egg adaptation, so the problem clearly runs a lot deeper than just the network being shitty. Martin's big problems with House of the Dragon all have to do with the scripts, and even then, he still does show himself to be very willing to compromise when it comes to the realities of filming a scene and what can realistically be done in live action versus what can be done with the written word. At the same time, however, he also makes a very compelling case for why certain omissions from the series, even at this early point in time, will spell disaster for the show's future, a sentiment which I fully and wholeheartedly agree with. Though, unlike him, I'm not as inclined to say I believe that the absence of Maelor is one of the really big omissions. Even with the scenario he laid out in the blog, I can still see a situation where Condal and Hess can rework the effect Maelor's death had on the war into the story without actually having Maelor be in it. Maybe I just want to believe that because I really don't want to watch Maelor's death happen on screen, but I still think Bitterbridge and everything that happens there is open-ended enough that it could somehow still make sense in the series later on. Really, it's everything else I mentioned in this video that has me worried, particularly Nettles. I mean, what's going to happen to Sheepstealer now? Is Rhaena going to go off and live in the mountains by herself? It's difficult to say. Something really changed over the course of this second season's airing. You could feel it in the way all the die-hard A Song of Ice and Fire fans were talking when the season started versus how they were talking once the season ended. The enthusiasm and rampant speculation started to die off more and more until the finale hit, and suddenly this wave of disappointment crashed into everyone, and now it kind of feels like the fans are right back where they were when Game of Thrones first ended. Both aggravated and despondent, and with a big return of the same sort of old-school style bitterness that has been directed towards George Martin everywhere he's gone since July 12, 2011. I get it. Over a decade and 2 kinda shitty TV shows later with more on the way, and yet he's only written 3 Dunk and Egg stories. It's gotten to the point where you'd be forgiven for thinking we're never going to get to read about the she-wolves of Winterfell, but you know, if you really do want that story to be told someday, maybe the fans of George Martin could learn to not treat him so shitty just because he's a little late in delivering your treats. Like, was the author of Berserk ever treated so poorly while he was still alive? And again, I get it, the Logan Lucky scene is very funny and it keeps getting funnier every year that passes, but you know, I really don't think it's so ridiculous to suggest that this behavior from the fans is a very significant reason for why maybe George R.R. Martin has been taking so long with this story. This year, one of his closest friends died, and it's clear that he's gotten a little disillusioned with the legacy the live-action adaptations of his work are leaving behind for him. Ultimately, House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones is probably going to reflect more on Martin than it is for Condell or Benioff or Weiss, especially if he never finishes the books. I think Martin realized this, and that's why over the past couple of years, he's tried so hard to steer these new Ice and Fire shows in the right direction. Unfortunately, though, at least in the case of House of the Dragon, all that work seems to be wasted. HBO and Warner Brothers own the rights to his universe, and as long as it's still profitable, they're going to milk Westeros for all it's got, whether George thinks the final product is good or not. Yes, George R.R. Martin should not be immune from criticism for how much he has indulged in these live-action adaptations, but at the same time, I can't imagine he ever expected Game of Thrones at HBO to end up like this. Remember, he made a deal with HBO in 2007, back when HBO was at the height of its powers, fresh off the success of The Sopranos and The Wire. I don't care who you are, that's a deal anybody would make at that point in time. Unfortunately, though, he doesn't have that HBO anymore. He has Warner Brothers Discovery's HBO, and they aren't in the business of making art, they are in the business of destroying art, and man, oh man, they are so fucking good at it.
So what was the fucking point in all this then?
A lot of cool things happened during the Dance of the Dragons, but the ability to trust that Condell and Hess are going to be capable of adapting this material into something similar to the novel has all but evaporated. Why get excited for the battle over the God's Eye? Why have faith that these writers are actually going to do anything like it was in the books? Or that HBO is even going to give them the budget that they need to see it through? I want to believe this show can be good. I want to believe the next 2 seasons will be winners, but the part of me with critical thinking skills knows that I shouldn't do that. And still, I will freely admit that I did like some stuff about this season. Criston Cole, Aegon, and Oakenfist's arcs were all really good, and I can see them all going in really interesting directions before the series ends. And not even all the changes made for the show were huge mistakes. Like, I love how they brought in Gwaine and used him as a foil for Cole. Criston was always kind of presented to us as the prototype Jaime, so I think it's very fitting that they gave him a noble knight like Brienne for him to play off of. There are specific moments and specific scenes and specific elements of this production that occasionally come together and can make it seem like maybe the show has something really good going. The spectacle of that one battle we did see was pretty great, but that was just one 20-minute sequence out of an 8-hour season. I'd like to believe this can be fixed. I'd like to believe that Season 3 is going to reverse course and start bringing things together, but the evidence presented to me does not imply that any of that is going to occur. Whether or not it does, however, the fact remains. When Season 2 of House of the Dragon started, I wanted to watch every episode right when it aired so I wouldn't miss out on anything. And now that Season 2 is over, I feel pretty confident that I'm going to just wait until all of Season 3 is finished before I start watching it. Hell, if HBO can't even pull off Dunk and Egg, then maybe I'll just skip the whole rest of the series entirely. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you watch the next one too. Goodbye.